Kristen Jacobson.
Hey everyone, I'm Kristen, the anxiety therapist, and today I want to talk about the power of the pause. So if you've ever known anyone who tends to be quick to anger or highly reactive, this is a tool that can come in very handy for them. And I think it's a very relatable concept because I imagine most of us have found ourselves in an emotionally charged moment where our instincts kind of drive us toward immediate reaction in a less than desirable way. This is a very primal response, and it includes the part of our brain called the amygdala. The amygdala acts as our emotional processing center. So when we're triggered, whether it's a conflict or criticism or really any perceived threat, this little cluster of neurons kind of sounds the alarm. It catapults us into this fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so while this was really helpful for our ancestors' survival, it often acts as a disservice in modern human interactions where we really want to respond in a more measured, thoughtful way. So the pause is sort of this act of self-discipline and mindfulness, and really a form of self-regulation. So it's the deliberate choice to step back, allow the emotions to subside a little bit, and then sort of chart our course of action. It's not a sign of indecision or weakness, but it's really a demonstration of our level of self-awareness and emotional intelligence. By waiting for that initial emotional surge or that reactivity to subside a little bit, then we can regain access to the prefrontal cortex, and that is our brain's sort of rational, reasonable center. So I like to describe this as sort of like two parts to our brain. We have our emotional brain and our logical brain or rational brain. And the emotional brain is the primitive part that's at the very base. And then the rational and logical part kind of covers that up. But when we are experiencing high emotions, our amygdala gets hijacked, and then we don't have access to that rational and logical part any longer. I just want to provide some examples to kind of illustrate how the power of the pause can be effective. So you might be in a professional setting. So let's say you're in a really high stakes meeting and a colleague kind of criticizes your work or your project. They're questioning its viability or your competence. So obviously you're going to get very defensive and angry, right? This is going to be sort of an overwhelming experience. But if you were to respond in that moment, you would probably respond from a place of defensiveness and anger, right? Probably not best for your career or your relationship with this colleague. But if you pause and take a moment to breathe and allow that sort of emotional fog to clear, then you can start to gain clarity on how to address this criticism more constructively. So maybe you invite a discussion on your project or your work's merits and areas for improvement. And so it sort of turns this potentially conflictual situation into more of a collaborative dialogue or conversation. The second example is the domestic dispute. If you have a partner, I'm sure you have encountered conflict at some point. Usually it's a misunderstanding or a miscommunication that then escalates into a heated argument. Sometimes we might want to retaliate with really sharp words or do something to sort of hurt the other person because we're feeling hurt. But that's just going to lead to a breakdown in the relationship, right? So choosing to pause and reflect can really kind of change the trajectory of the entire conversation. When you sort of practice that restraint and pause for a moment and let your emotions settle, you are more able to understand your partner's perspective. You might feel a little bit more compassion and understanding toward them, and then work toward a resolution or a repair. And that is really the most important thing that strengthens the relationship. If we are very reactive during this conflict, then the relationship is going to be eroded. But if we work toward repair, then that ultimately strengthens the relationship. And the third example is the digital impulse. So have you ever received an email or saw something on social media where you like immediately wanted to reply. In our digital age, immediate responses are the norm, right? And this is where the power of the pause comes in, because taking a step back before responding and pausing can really be the difference between a regrettable, impulsive action and a more measured, respectful response. Once it's out there on social media, it lives on forever. So we're talking about future employers or your children or whatnot. That's not going anywhere. So we have to be very careful about our reactivity when it comes to social media and emails. Some practical tips for implementing the pause is one, to breathe deeply. When we're triggered and our amygdala gets hijacked, our nervous system is really amped up. So we want to breathe deeply. This helps to regulate our nervous system. It also serves as sort of this physical manifestation of the pause, right? Because if you're breathing deeply, you're not lashing out with your words. Second, you want to count to 10 or even 20 or 30, depending on the situation. Super simple but effective technique. This counting gives your rational brain time to catch up with your emotional brain. And then finally, you want to reflect instead of reacting. Ask yourself, will this immediate reaction really serve my long-term goals? What are the consequences of this immediate reaction, which might give you that emotional release, but it's inevitably going to have consequences when it comes to relationships with other people, right? And so just reflecting on this, we can sort of redirect that impulse and react in a more thoughtful way that's more in alignment with how we want to show up in relationships. So I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear your own experiences with, just reactivity, or maybe you've used the pause so that you wouldn't be as reactive, because I know I personally have tons of examples of times I've been reactive. So I try to be cognizant of my reactivity and the impact that it's going to have. Am I modeling poor emotional regulation for my kids, or am I lashing out at my husband and saying something mean that I'm going to regret later, right? So just kind of be cognizant and reflect on where this shows up in your life and see if you can implement the power of the pause in those situations. So let me know in the comments your own experiences, and I hope you all have a great week.